Hello friends, welcome to another episode of a video series in which we discuss some of the more sordid stories of sacred scripture and traverse paths that few pilgrims dare to tread. I want you to think about some of the more famous people of the Bible, the heroes. Men like David and Moses and Abraham. The exemplars of righteousness and faith, right? These are bright lights in an otherwise dark landscape of murder, bloodshed, and debauchery. But you astute readers out there already know that the Bible isn't so simple. Even the good guys are flawed and complicated. Take David, for instance, and his debacle with Bathsheba and his subsequent murder of her husband Uriah. It doesn't get much more dark than that. But then even Moses has his black eye, doesn't he? He, after a lapse in obedience and humility, was forbidden from entering the land of Canaan. This after leading the people of Israel around the wilderness for 40 years. But what about Father Abraham? Now there's a righteous soul, right? If anybody has a sterling record, it's Abraham. Well, once again, those of you who have stuck to your daily Bible reading schedules and have gotten through the book of Genesis might remember an episode in which Abraham does something kind of nasty to his wife, Sarah, at the hands, more or less, of Pharaoh. I am, of course, referring to the incident in which Abraham insisted that Sarah tell everybody that she was his sister rather than his wife. And she was whisked away to the harem of Pharaoh. And Abraham profited quite handsomely from the affair. Well, that's pretty hairy, but the reason why I bring it up is that it might be a surprise to many of you that Abraham made kind of a habit of this wife pimping, and that he did it not once, but twice. And, as they say, the nut never falls far from the tree. Apparently, this made a real impression on his son Isaac, who sometime later, after Abraham's death, did the same thing with his wife Rebekah. Now, what's going on here? So, we have 3 instances of wife pimping here in the same family. Wow, is there something else going on here? This story is repeated 3 times? Well, that should raise some red flags for you. And we're going to do what we so often do with this video series, is after I tell you the stories, we're going to put on our thinking caps, and we're going to be armchair scholars for a few minutes while we try to unpack what might actually be going on with these 3 sequences. And who knows, we might just be able to exonerate Abraham from at least some of the guilt that comes with this behavior. I'll let you be the judge, but for now, settle in, and let me tell you these 3 stories. Now, the first of these 3 sequences occurs relatively early in Abraham's career. He is not yet known as Abraham, but Abram, and his wife Sarah is not yet Sarah, but Sarai. But to keep things simple, I'm going to refer to them as Abraham and Sarah. So, he has only recently been called by God to adventure, to go to the promised land, or, in God's words, to a land where I will show you. But Abraham's been dragging his feet about that, and it isn't until his father Terah dies that Abraham finally gets around to obeying the command and heads on to Canaan. But he isn't there long before a severe famine hits the land, and he's not able to stay. So he packs up his gear, and his wife Sarah and all his servants and everything. He's by this time already a rich man, and he heads south to Egypt. And on the way he says something rather strange to his dear wife. He says, "Woman, I perceive that you are a comely and handsome woman. And when the Egyptians see you, they will say, 'Behold, this is her husband,' and they will kill me for your sake and leave you alive. I pray, therefore, that you will say you are my sister, so that it will be well with me on your account, and I will live because of you." Wow, words to make a girl swoon, right? Well, Abraham is 75 and Sarah is 65. They've been married a while, so perhaps the bud of chivalry and romance has long since withered from the vine. Anyway, what is Abraham thinking? So apparently, Sarah is such a hottie that when the Egyptians lay eyes on her, they're going to lose their minds and kill him in order to have her. I don't know why alternatives didn't occur to him. Maybe like having her wear a veil? Dressing her up as a leper? Leaving her in the tent? I don't know. There were surely other ways, right? But it seems Abraham's best strategy for protecting her virtue is not to protect it at all, but leave it out there in the open. And, parenthetically, we might ask, if the Egyptians are such thugs that they would kill a man and take his wife, why wouldn't they kill a man and take the rest of what he has too? Anyway, Abraham does appear to be spot on about what the Egyptians think about Sarah. They lay eyes on this hot new Hebrew Bedouin from the hinterlands of Palestine, and they're just beside themselves. She's the most beautiful thing they've ever seen. Hey, son, I ain't never seen Angora look so good on a woman. Well, the princes and the nobles get hold of this information, and they see her, and they say, boys, we got to tell Pharaoh about this. And Pharaoh comes down and has a look at her, and apparently asks about her marital status. And Sarah says, he's not my husband. He's my brother. I'm his sister. We're brother and sister. And Pharaoh takes her off to his harem. Well, we don't know how long Sarah is under Pharaoh's care, and we don't know whether or not he sleeps with her. The text doesn't say. That's left to our imagination. It's left to Abraham's imagination as well. And you wonder what he thinks all this, even as he's being enriched by Pharaoh, who gives him ox and sheep and donkeys and male servants and female servants and all kinds of additions to his already apparently substantial wealth. Well, things seem to be going well, at least ostensibly, for Abraham, but not so well for poor old Pharaoh, who's suddenly come down with a bunch of plagues. We don't know what kind of plagues they are, but they inflict him and his household. So much that Pharaoh gets curious, summons up his soothsayers and bone rattlers and seers to do a root cause analysis of the situation. And they quickly narrow it down to the harem. Hey boss, there's something up with this new girl you brought in. She ain't no virgin. Hell, she ain't even single. And that bearded fella out there, he ain't her brother. Well, Pharaoh is hot. And if there was ever a time that Abraham might fear for his life, it might be now. Pharaoh marches Sarah out to meet Abraham and says, boy, what the hell have you done to me? You told me she was your sister, and here I brought her into my wedding chamber. Now the King James Version says, what have you done? I might have taken her to wife. But the New International Version says, for I took her as a wife. And it turns out that the NIV is more true to the Hebrew. The Hebrew doesn't say might have. The Hebrew doesn't say possibly, could have, maybe. It says, I took her as a wife. Now, does that mean they slept together? I don't know. Anyway, Pharaoh charges his men to escort Abraham with his possessions and his wife out of the territory. He says, take your stuff and take your wife and get out. Okay. Well, that's sequence number one. Let's talk about sequence number two. The next episode takes place 25 years later. Abraham is 100 and Sarah is 90. And lots of things have happened in the intervening 25 years. He's been promised a son. He's pled the case for Sodom and Gomorrah. He's been visited by God a few times, right? And he's also taken 300 of his trained men into armed combat with 5 kings to rescue his nephew, Lot. So lots of stuff. Lots of things to develop a man's faith and his confidence, right? Not to mention wealth. But for reasons we don't know, he's sojourning again, as the scriptures like to call it. He's traveling south and winds up in Gerar, which is, as far as the Bible is concerned, Philistia, the Philistine people, historical enemies of God. And he finds himself under the care of Abimelech. And once again, Abraham is up to his old tricks. She's my sister. And Abimelech takes 90-year-old Sarah off to his bedchamber, or off to his palace, I should say, as a wife. And again, Abraham is left cooling his heels, wondering when the wealth is going to pour in. Meanwhile, God visits Abimelech in a dream. So God says to Abimelech, you are a dead man because of this woman, for she is another man's wife. Now Abimelech answers back and says kind of what we've all been thinking here. First of all, I haven't touched her. Second of all, he said that she was his sister. I didn't know she was a married woman. I took her out of the integrity of my heart. And he says something else here that's really interesting. He says, what does he say? Let's find out. You wouldn't also slay a righteous nation, would you? Now that's reminiscent of words that Abraham himself said some time ago when pleading the case for Sodom and Gomorrah. You wouldn't destroy the righteous with the unrighteous, would you? The writers of this story had a sense of humor and a sense of irony, that the good guy isn't the good guy and the bad guy isn't the bad guy. But listen to what God says to Abimelech in response. He says, in Genesis chapter 20, verse 6 and following, "I know that you did this out of the innocence of your heart. That is why I prevented you from sinning against me by sleeping with her." Well, thank goodness for that. "Now you must restore this man, for he is a prophet, and he shall pray for you, so that you and yours will be healed and shall not die." Apparently, which we will learn later, all of the women of Abimelech's household had become barren. So that might tell you just how long Sarah was with Abimelech, right? Now, what is this? So you're going to have the guy without integrity pray for the guy who showed integrity. Anyway, so once again, a real sense of irony here. And then God, always getting in the last word, says, "But be assured, if you do not restore this man's wife, you and yours shall surely die." So early the next morning, Abimelech gathers his servants and tells them what's going on. And they are terrified. He marches Sarah out to Abraham and says, "What the sandhill are you doing to me, son? You realize I could have slept with that woman and brought all manner of curses down on the heads of me and mine. Why the hell would you do something like that to me?" So Abraham actually answers. And his response is quite interesting. It's the reason why this, of all three stories, is my favorite, because the characters are so much more loquacious and expressive. You kind of get inside their heads. Abraham's answer is lame, pathetic, and self-contradictory. You'll see what I mean. He says, "Well, the way I figured, there was no fear of God in this country, and they will surely kill me because of her. So I said," whatever. The next thing he says is, "And she really is my sister. Same father, different mother." Okay. Finally, he adds, "From the very beginning I have said to Sarah, my wife, that wherever we go, whenever we journey into a strange land, this is how she shall show her love for me, that she says I'm her brother and she is my sister." Okay, well, let's just pick this apart for a minute. So, first of all, what an insult to Abimelech, right? There is no fear of God in this country. But the irony is that in both cases, that in both circumstances in which Abraham feared for his life, the so-called enemy proves to be more honorable than he. The second is, well, just lame. I mean, okay, she's my half-sister. It's still a lie. And finally, his response, "This has been our agreement from the beginning, that wherever we go, you'll call me your brother, and you'll be my sister." So first of all, he tells Abimelech that the reason why they're masquerading as brother and sister is because he fears for his life in this godless country. But then he turns around and tells him it's a matter of general policy. So which is it, Abraham? So as far as I'm concerned, his answers fall flat, and I don't think Abimelech would buy it either. Here's what Abimelech does. He gives Abraham a whole bunch of gifts. Once again, the donkeys, the turkeys, the oxen, the buffalo, so on and so forth. And then he says something rather strange to Sarah. "I've given your brother 1,000 pieces of silver for you as a covering of the eyes." And it says Sarah was reproved. It was kind of like his way of rebuking her and saying, "Shame on you for playing into all this." So Abraham, once again, is a rich man because of this whole enterprise. Abimelech tells his men, "Leave the man alone, don't touch him." And so Abraham goes on his way. And that's the second story. Now the third and final story I'm going to tell you involves Isaac and Rebekah, and is after Abraham and Sarah have died and some things have gone on, and there's another famine in the land, the scripture says, and this is in Genesis chapter 26. There was a famine in the land like in the days of Abraham, so severe that Isaac again has to leave, and he's headed south to Egypt. Sound familiar? But God heads him off the pass and says, "Don't go down to Egypt. For I have given this land to you and yours, and made this promise to Abraham that I will multiply his seed," and sort of reiterates the promise, that the promise also extends to him, Isaac. And so Isaac shrugs his shoulders and heads off into, you guessed it, Gerar. And who does he meet but Abimelech? Now, I don't know whether this is the same Abimelech as was with Abraham, or as the exegetes and apologists like to say that this is a different Abimelech, and Abimelech is like Pharaoh, just a title. There might be a simpler explanation for that, which we'll see in a few minutes, but bear with me. So he's in the land of Gerar, under the auspices of Abimelech, And one day Abimelech throws open the palace windows and takes a look across the pasture and looks down and happens to see Isaac doing something very unbrotherly with Rebekah. Now that's kind of weird, isn't it? You talk about public shame. How did that come to pass? Don't they have tents even then? Anyway, he looks out the window and sees this and is scandalized and goes, "Hey! She ain't your sister! That's your wife!" That's a generous assumption, I think. He marches down there and gives him a speech very similar to what the other Abimelech gave to Abraham. He says, "What in the world are you doing, son? One of my fellows might have slept with that woman and there'd been all kinds of trouble." He says, "Why would you do something like this?" And what do you think Isaac's answer is? He learned from Pops. He says, "Well, I figured they would kill me for her sake because she was fair to look upon." Okay? Now, pause here. Let's rewind the clock a little bit and let me remind you how old Sarah was when Abimelech took her. She was 90 years old. Okay? Now, again, exegetes and interpreters of the text will say, well, but Abimelech was, you see, not interested in sex with her. She was interested in political alliances. She was a wife of a powerful man. Well, that might be an explanation. But the thing is, in every other situation, the husbands are afraid for their lives because their wives were beautiful. And Abraham even says to Abimelech, "I thought there was no fear of God in this land, so I thought they would take her." Why would Abraham think that they would take a woman for purposes of political alliances? It never has added up to me. It seems as lame as Abraham's answer to Abimelech. Anyway, back to Isaac. So Abimelech says to his people, "Don't touch this man or his wife, and anybody that does will be put to death." Meanwhile, Isaac goes off and it says that his farming adventures yield 100-fold. And that he is a much more successful farmer, sheep herder, grazer, whatever you may call it, than anyone around him. And he got so powerful and so wealthy that the people of the land told him to leave because he was so much greater than they. And then there was some kerfuffles over some wells and so on and so forth. But the point is, Isaac is once again enriched over Abimelech. Okay. So that's as far as I'm going to go with the third story. So there you have it. 3 instances of wife pimping in the family of Abraham. All right. So let's put our thinking caps on and try and unpack these 3 stories. Because if you're still with me and you've heard these stories in sequence, you might have noticed something rather interesting about the text. These are the same story, told with different characters in different places. But the structure of these stories is virtually identical. Now, most readers miss this because they don't read the stories one after another. They're spaced enough so that as they read their daily chapters, by the time they get to each story, each one might be somewhat familiar. But they miss the fact that the stories are so similar. If you read the stories in sequence, Genesis chapter 12, Genesis chapter 20, and Genesis chapter 26, this becomes very clear. So what's going on? Why do we have the same story repeated 3 times with all the same elements? Well, I'm going to tell you, this was no accident. It wasn't an accident by the writers, but most importantly, this wasn't an accident of mere history, okay? The storytellers, or the redactors of the text who wove these stories together for us, were making a deliberate literary point. So let's talk about that point for a minute. What were the writers doing here? To best illustrate what the storytellers had in mind, let's look at the very first version of this story, Abraham, Sarah in Egypt. So what happened? What were the events? Let's look at it. First of all, you have the patriarch Abraham driven out of Canaan because of a famine. So he goes to Egypt for relief. When he arrives, Pharaoh takes Sarah captive, enslaves her, if you will, right? And what shows Pharaoh the error of his ways are plagues sent by God. Pharaoh then releases Sarah and drives Abraham out. Abraham then leaves with the plunder of Egypt. Now, does this sound familiar to you? It ought to. Because this, folks, is the Exodus story. These are the very same elements that lead us through the whole sequence of events at the end of Genesis. And, I might add, the Exodus story is the fulcrum on which the entire Pentateuch rests, right? It's the central story. Everything after the Exodus points back to this event. God constantly reminding the Israelites that, remember how I led you by the hand out of Israel. And of course the Passover feast that they were supposed to observe every year. And of course before the Exodus, the stories and narrative points towards Exodus, like this story does. Now remember, by the time these stories were written down and codified, they would have been very familiar to the ears of those who heard them, because they came from an oral tradition in which these stories were told over and over again. So when they heard the Abraham and Sarah in Egypt story, they would have recognized immediately what was going on. And they would have gone, aha! Then they would have heard the Abimelech and Abraham story and gone, now this sounds familiar. This harkens back to the original Abraham and Sarah story. And then they get to the Isaac and Rebekah story with Abimelech, and the text itself draws their minds back to the original Abraham story. So that's interesting. So first we have the motif of the Exodus story, the referencing a greater meta-narrative, and then we have the repetition. What's going on with the repetition? So once again, this is a method commonly used by the Hebrew writers to create emphasis, right? Example being, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. Or Jesus saying, truly, truly, I say unto you. That is a very ancient tradition right there, right? It says, hey, listen up, this is really important. We see this all the time of doublets and triplets, stories put there not by accident, but to emphasize something that's greater than those individual stories themselves, which we've addressed before, such as Judah's rod of shame, or Joseph's cloak, or Abraham and Sarah in Egypt. They're used as literary devices to foreshadow a greater story, a meta-narrative, as I said. So again, the storytellers and the redactors of the story, they knew what they were doing, and they weren't just interested in the mere recitation of history. These guys were creating literature. Misses the point. So I know that not all interpreters are comfortable with this analysis. Those who are committed to a strict historical interpretation of the text often miss this nuance and this richness in the text. Perhaps it makes them uncomfortable to think that, well, if this is true, then these stories are in fact developed or created, if you will. But let me remind you that even Mike Licona, a philosopher and Christian apologist, says, quote, ancient biographers were not aiming at modern precision, end quote. And this is abundantly clear when we carefully study the text, and we see these motifs built into the stories. Okay, well, let's revisit my original question. Did Abraham actually pimp out his wife twice and then inculcate his son with the same practice? Well, I don't know. And to dwell on that maybe misses the point that the storytellers were trying to present to us. Whether you believe these stories are historical or not, I hope you have a greater appreciation for the depth and richness of the text. And if you've come this far, I hope this has been interesting to you. I hope you've got something out of it. I hope you also stick around for the next video and that you'll hit the like button, maybe even leave a review or a comment. Thank you very much, and you've been very patient, and Lord willing, see you next time. In relief, wind up being enslaved by Egypt and spend, seriously? And spend some time, 450 years, in Egypt before the 10 plagues.